On behalf of Balvant Parekh Center for General Semantics and Other Human Sciences, I welcome you all to the 4th Balvant Parekh Memorial Lecture. The annual Balvant Parekh Memorial Lecture has been instituted by the Center as a tribute to the memory of Sri Balvant K. Parekh, who is the inspiration behind all our endeavors. The lecture series has featured scholars like W.J.T. Mitchell, Homi Bhabha, and Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, among others, in the past few years. And this year, we are very happy to have among us Professor Rodolphe Gachet, a distinguished professor and Eugenio Donato Chair of Comparative Literature at the State University of New York, Buffalo, who will deliver the lecture titled Europe and the Stranger. Like the Balvant Parekh Center for General Semantics and Other Human Sciences, Sri Balvant Parekh has left behind a rich legacy through the institutions he founded and supported. Balvant Bhai was an avid reader of all kinds of texts, but his special interest was in the fields of general semantics, philosophy, classics, literature, and psychoanalysis, and he had a grand vision of disseminating the benefits of knowledge as widely as possible. He studied law, had a precise scientific temperament, and was never dogmatic in the pursuit of his goals. Balvant Parekh Center is committed to continuing the good work that he initiated through its workshop and publications in the field of general semantics and is steadily branching into newer territories in psychology, education, communication studies, and behavioral sciences. We thank the Parekh family who had been a tremendous support in translating Balvant Bhai's dreams through the activities of the center. The Forum on Contemporary Theory, which began in a modest way in 1989 as an informal institution in the Faculty of Arts of the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda, and has now acquired global visibility through its academic programs and publications, continues to work concurrently with Balvant Parekh Center in its activities and programs. Balvant Bhai had always wished that the memorial lecture would bring in the best of the minds in the field of academia to Baroda, and we are privileged to have Professor Gachet with us for this year's event. Professor Gachet studied philosophy and comparative literature in Munich, Berlin, and Paris, and holds an MA and PhD in philosophy from the Freie Universität Berlin. His interests concerned 19th and 20th century French literature, critical theory, and its relation to continental philosophy since early Romanticism. Besides translating major works by Derrida and Lacan into German and publishing numerous articles in a variety of scholarly journals, he has published several wonderful books, including The Train of the Mirror, Derrida and the Philosophy of Reflection, The Idea of Form, Rethinking Kant's Aesthetics, and Europe, or the Infinite Task, a study of a philosophical concept, and continues doing groundbreaking work in philosophy. Please welcome Professor Gachet with a big round of applause. We are honored to have you, sir.
I'm deeply grateful to Dr. Patel, to Dr. Prafala's invitation and thrust, and I hope that my remarks will line up with his expectations. Thank you. I am all the more honored by this invitation because of the Centers for General Semantics and Other Human Sciences' unfledgling commitment under his leadership to the humanities at a time when the humanities' role in the academia is anything but secure. I will speak about an hour, but should I go beyond the hour, 5 or 10 minutes, I don't know, please bear with me. So as you know, the title is Europe and the Stranger. Although I do not deny the claim that Greece is the origin, or at least one of the most important beginnings of Europe, I wish to reconsider what of Greece has been constructed as the origin of Europe, or the West, by focusing on one Platonic dialogue, the Sophist, a dialogue which, because of its complexity and difficulty, has not received as much attention with respect to the question of Europe than other Platonic discourses. in order to show that even within Platonic philosophy, commonly considered as the source of Platonism, that is essentially of Western metaphysics, new starts are made, more precisely starts so radically innovative as to demand not only a systematic interrogation of the tradition of philosophical beginnings in Greece, but even the parasite of Greek philosophy's founding father. Significantly enough, the author of this new beginning of philosophizing within the Platonic dialogue in question, and that means within a Greek text, is a stranger. Throughout the dialogue, he is simply referred to as the stranger, o xenos. Even though, as Bernard Waldenfels has argued, that which is strange or foreign does not constitute a fundamental concept of classical philosophy, the prominence of the stranger in this Platonic dialogue, not to speak as yet of his radical overhaul of all philosophical thought, represents perhaps another beginning of Greek thought in Greek thought itself, that even though its legacy is perhaps the least attended to, I propose to consider as the beginning of a certain Europe, a Europe to come. Since there are frequently strangers present in the Platonic dialogues, the prominent role that the stranger enjoys in the sophist does not at first seem to be something particularly new. Even Theodorus, the mathematician, who in the opening lines introduces the stranger to Socrates, is from Cyrene, and the sophist, the main topic of the dialogue, is, as Plato regularly points out in all of his dialogues, a stranger who travels from city to city. All these strangers are identified by their names. However, besides the anonymous Athenian in the laws, the stranger of the sophist is the only stranger who remains anonymous in all of Plato's writings. More precisely, without a patronym, that is, a stranger to the end. Undoubtedly, Theodorus introduces him as, I'm quoting, kin from Elea, as an associate of the people around Parmenides and Zeno, and as a very philosophical man, end quote. He comes from Elea, an Ionian colony on the Tyrrhenian coast of southern Italy, founded by expatriates from Phocaea on the eastern extreme of the Greek domain, who, after having been threatened by the despotic empires of the Persians, found refuge on what from that moment on became the western extreme of Magna Graecia. It is here on the western edge of the Greek domain that after the first wave of Greek philosophy, Ionian philosophy of nature, which originated on the west coast of Asia Minor, an area that had been colonized by refugees from the Greek mainland, flying before the Dorians and other tribes, that the second wave of philosophical thought emerged. Elea is the home of Parmenides and Zeno. Now thus Theodorus' information that the stranger is a native of Elea and an associate of the Parmenidean school of philosophizing give us a more concrete sense of who the stranger is? On the contrary, I hold that by linking him to a colony of expatriates and philosophers in exile, his nature of a stranger is even further emphasized. But what about the fact that Theodorus characterizes him as a very philosophical man? Two things, at least, need to be pointed out here. Theodorus, the mathematician, was a former friend of Protagoras. But in search of real truth, he deserted the sophist's art of speech and empty dialectic for mathematical knowledge, that is, the solid knowledge of immutable members and mathematical ratios. It follows from this that Theodorus, and by implication his student Theaetetus, who will be the stranger's interlocutor in the dialogue, does not know what true philosophy is and what his knowledge in particular consists of. Furthermore, at the beginning of an inquiry into the figure of the sophist, whom the many confuse with the philosopher, and which is also one of the disguises under which he appears in the cities, nothing has yet been established with respect to the nature of the philosopher. In short, Theodorus' characterization of the stranger as a philosophical man does not make him any more concrete. Now, if in distinction from all the other participants of the dialogue, including those who, like the young Socrates, remain silent throughout the dialogue, we are not told anything about the Xenos himself, about the stranger himself. Is it not precisely because Plato wants him to remain a stranger with a capital S, if you will? There's a purpose there for Plato to keep him unidentifiable, a stranger to the end. Finally, if it does not make historical sense to ask who the stranger is, it is also important to avoid the temptation of many commentators to account for the stranger by construing him as an extension of Socrates, or simply as a double of Plato. All these readings avoid the question of the stranger himself and what it ultimately means for the dialogue to feature a stranger as such, without a patronym, without a name to begin with, something which, according to Plato, is the strangest of all things. So let us ask what a xenos is to begin with. According to Little and Scott, the term means first, I quote, a guest friend, applied to persons and states bound by a treaty or tie of hospitality, end quote, and only secondarily of strangers, wanderers, refugees, or foreigners. As its further meaning of a hireling, especially as a mercenary soldier, indicates, the contractual connotation of the term makes it in fact impossible to translate it, as it is conventionally done, simply as guest. The xenos is more than just a guest. One has an obligation to host him. The xenos is always someone from a foreign city or land to whom one owes respectful treatment. To translate the term as stranger captures the foreignness of this guest. Furthermore, the xenos, and this will be very important, is, as we will see in a moment, always protected by a god, by Xus Xenios in particular. At this juncture, I would already like to broach, however briefly, what, apart from the doctrine that he will eventually lay out, Plato's stakes are in giving an eminent voice to such a stranger in this dialogue. After Theodorus' introduction of the stranger, Socrates, in an explicit reference to Homer's Odyssey, wonders whether rather than bringing with him an ordinary guest, he might not have brought a god instead. Or more precisely, he asks Theodorus whether it might have escaped him that the guest he has brought might be accompanied by a god. Socrates avers, I quote, that besides the other gods, the god of strangers especially becomes a companion to those men who participate in just reverence, dikaias, and here Socrates cites chant 17 of the Odyssey, looks down on both outrages and lawful conduct. And Plato continues, Socrates continues, so perhaps here too, someone of the higher powers may be accompanying you to keep an eye on us and to refute us, since we are feeble at giving accounts, a sort of refuting God, end quote. With the suggestion that in spite of his appearance, the stranger might indeed be a god or be accompanied by a god, Socrates raises the status of the stranger to that of someone who might have the extraordinary power of cross-examination, of giving accounts or reasoning that surpasses that of all the participants, himself included. In other words, Socrates and the other participants of the dialogue expressed their welcome to a stranger who, like a god of refutation, has come to Athens from abroad to expose their weakness in philosophical discourse and to put into question some of its underlying self-evidences. At this point in the dialogue, the reader does not yet know what the stranger will take issue with, and how radical his interrogation of the whole of Greek philosophizing hitherto will be. But we should already take notice of the unheard of fact that by rejecting the views of all his predecessors, Plato, in Stanley Rosen's words, suggests that, I quote, prior to the eleatic stranger, there have been no genuine philosophers, but only phantasms of philosophers, end quote. And by extension, no philosophy, strictly speaking. In what follows, I intend to bring home this point, that the stranger's philosophical doctrine is a philosophy for the first time. And furthermore, that it is a philosophy, rather than, for example, sophistry, precisely because it is elaborated by a stranger, who is not only a foreigner in Athens, but who is also estranged from any home, in short, by a subject which is no longer native, earthborn, or autochthonous. Before Plato calls on the stranger to speak, Socrates, still in charge of the conversation, says that philosophers are certainly as difficult to discern as gods, since, I quote, abetted by the ignorance of others, those who are philosophers in their very being, make their appearance in all sorts of ways, end quote. Sometimes they appear in the disguises of the statesman, the sophist, or even the madman, and therefore he would like to know how the stranger's Eleatic associates think about these designations, whether they conceive of them as names for one referent, or whether they designate three different figures with these terms. With this question, the overall concern of the dialogue, marking clearly off what the sophist and the philosopher are, is announced. Yet after several attempts to track down the sophist by way of the characteristically Socratic method of the division of a genre, look, or aspect of the sophist, first as a hunter of rich young men for cash payment, second as a wholesale, or third, retail peddler, mostly in second-hand knowledge concerning virtue, but of which he is at times also, fourth, the manufacturer, fifth, as an heuristic mercenary, i.e., one who teaches how to dispute on good and evil for gain, and sixth, a philosopher-like cleanser of souls. After all these attempts, which all fail in some way, because the many-sided animal that is the sophist musters endless ways of escaping being pinned down by a definition, the stranger and Theaetetus return to the fifth definition in order to make a final attempt of analyzing him under his look as a debater and a teacher of the art of controversy about everything. However, if this universal art, if you can call it universal, if this universal art to which he pretends presupposes a knowledge of all subject matters, the sophist is necessarily a fake. But where then does the wondrous power of sophistry, which it has especially for the young, come from? This power comes, as the stranger intimates, from the sophist's unique art of producing, like a demiurge of sorts, all things. This art His art is that of mimesis, the imitative art of creating, like a painter, but in the sophist case in speech, replica, that is, verbal images of everything that from a distance look like the real things that to the inexperienced, and give them the illusion that although they are only, I quote, imitations and namesakes of the things that are, they are spoken truly, and hence that the speaker is the wisest of all in all things, end quote. As a result, the fifth definition of the sophist has become more refined. He now appears as a sort of enchanter and hence imitator, and to belong to the, I'm quoting here, the wonder-working kind, end quote. With this, the genre in which the stranger will be located, with this genre in which the stranger will seek to locate and thus to arrest the sophist in the final division is in place. But in order to determine the exact place that the sophist occupies within mimetic art, the stranger divides it into two forms: likeness making, that is the making of true images, icons in Greek, and semblance or apparition making, that is the art of making distorted images, phantasma in Greek. Now, if the stranger and his interlocutor are at loss regarding the kind of image making to which the sophist's speech belongs, it is precisely because the assumption that within the art of image making there is a branch that makes distorted, elusive, deceptive, and ultimately false images of what is, that's the reason why they are hesitating or at loss of in what category to put the sophist. Indeed, to commit oneself to the view that there is such an art implies the assumption that there can be falsehood and non-being, that falsehood and non-being can have existence, that it can be real. If we are here at a decisive turning point in the dialogue, it is because the new look with which to pin down the sophist requires the task of demonstrating that non-being has reality, or that falsehood has reality, and that it pervades reality as much as the discourse about it. Such an assumption, however, without which the sophist cannot be arrested once and for all, runs up against the whole of the reflections on being that have dominated Greek thought from Ionian physiologism to, in particular, the Eleatic doctrine of being, that is the doctrine of Father Parmenides, as the stranger will soon call him, according to whom one can say solely of being that it is, while non-being, because it is not, cannot be said without contradicting oneself. In short, in order to hunt down the sophist and to establish his being, the stranger will in fact have to become the refuting God, as which Socrates had characterized him at the beginning of the dialogue, and thus also, I hold, the founder of a novel way of philosophizing, if not even the founder of the first genuine form of philosophy. But let me return to the impasse, perplexity, or aporia, in which the stranger and Theaetetus find themselves after they have distinguished an art of making faithful copies, and one which simulates making copies, after they have distinguished an art of making faithful copies, and one which simulates making copies, and which implies that the non-being and the falsehood that they contain must in some sense exist, that is, have being. But as the stranger remarks, to hold that non-being has being is an audacity, considering, I'm quoting here, Parmenides the Great's, end quote, contention that only being is, and that non-being, because it is not, is, I quote again, unutterable, unspeakable and irrational. In other words, without first having resolved the question of how one can speak of non-being without being hemmed in by contradiction, it is impossible to pursue the effort on which the stranger and Theaetetus have embarked in the final division to surround the sophist. Hence the need to interrupt the seventh division by an ontological investigation, an investigation into being and non-being, after which alone the full difference between the philosopher and the sophist can be established. Before starting the controversy over being and non-being, the stranger presses upon Theaetetus not to, I quote, suppose that he is becoming a sort of parasite, end quote. To Theaetetus' exclamation of surprise at this request, the stranger explains, I quote, "In defending ourselves against the sophist, we will be compelled to put the argument of my father Parmenides to the test, and to force our way to the conclusion that non-being in some respect is, and that being in turn is not in some way," end quote. The stranger's filial piety is not at issue here. He speaks of my father, Parmenides. Indeed, the questioning of the Parmenian doctrine is called for by the need to defend philosophical thought from anti-sophistic heuristics, which draws its tools from Parmenides himself. In it, the sophist has so far eluded the seventh definition by refusing to acknowledge non-being, as Parmenides did, in the shape of falsehood, on the basis of Parmenides' claim that one can only speak of that which is, and that hence what he offers in speech cannot by definition be false, but must be true. One could even go so far as to say that the parasite of Father Parmenides is necessitated by the need to defend Parmenides from himself, in short, from indeed a sophistic temptation of philosophical thought itself. Yet even though the reputation of Parmenides is not strictly speaking a parasite, but as we will see, a radical transformation of his conception of being and non-being, the evocation of a parasite is testimony to the powerful esteem in which the Eleatic philosopher was held in Greek thought. Furthermore, the stranger's reference to Parmenides as his father, that is, to the unquestioned authority that the figure of the father enjoyed in Greece until it became challenged by sophist enlightenment in Athens at the end of the 5th century, thus about the same time that the dialogue on the sophist supposedly was written, that the dialogue supposedly occurred, gives the stranger's struggle against him all the looks of a factual parasite. After still an additional request, namely not to be taken for mad, the stranger finally, I quote, dares to take on the paternal argument, end quote. More precisely, he takes on the whole history of philosophical thinking in Greece before him, which he characterizes as made up by stories or fairy tales, mythoi, myths, about being. He distinguishes two main camps. One which reaches from Ionian philosophy of nature to Eleatic philosophy, that is, to Parmenides, and which try to define being numerically, in the case of Parmenides as one. And another camp made up of those who try to define being by corporeal reality or by invisible intelligible forms. The two parties of this latter camp are referred to as the earth-born giants and the gods. The two parties of this latter camp are referred to as, on the one hand, the earth-born giants, and on the other hand, the gods. And they are said to be at war with one another since time immemorial. In describing this battle, the stranger spares none of the parties, especially not the giants, who become the occasion for Plato for developing his, in my view, most radical critique of autochthony, that is, of nativeness or aboriginality. Unfortunately, for reasons of time, I cannot go into details, nor do I have the time to address the highly complex technical and logical difficulties that both camps' reflections on being and non-being contain. To make things short, after having failed by examining the thoughts of previous philosophers to say what non-being is, at the end of their investigation of the tradition, the stranger and Theaetetus have also to admit that on the basis of their predecessors, it is impossible to establish what being is. Both the thinking of being and non-being lead to logical impasses. Throughout the divisions intent on capturing the sophist, the stranger and Theaetetus had already repeatedly encountered aporias, which forced them to restart anew. But after the failure to say what non-being is, the aporia that emerged when they thought to determine being marks the most crucial transition in the entire dialogue, because the new level of reflection to which it leads involves philosophy itself. Indeed, the stranger and Theaetetus now face the impossibility of thinking both being and non-being. They are stuck in an impasse between two unresolvable issues. And yet, as the stranger remarks, I quote, "Since being and non-being have both had equal share in perplexity, there is now hope that in whatever way one of them comes to light more dimly or more clearly, so the other will come to light. And again, if we are able to see neither of them, we'll at least push our account through both at once as fittingly as we can." End quote. If the aporia in which they find themselves at this juncture is the most crucial one in the dialogue, it is because the very enterprise of forcing a way through this impasse is what will hereafter define the philosophical. By opening a passageway as fittingly as possible between being and non-being, whose aporetic nature results from misunderstanding of the entire tradition of the nature of being, in whose wake non-being had to be conceived as the opposite of being, the stranger presents himself as the first philosopher, as it were, or if you will, of a new kind, if not an other kind, of the philosopher. Needless to say, I'm referring here to his doctrine of the greatest kinds, megista gene, which the stranger is about to develop, and which represents the core of his ontological investigation. Kinds is the expression, in the expression the greatest kinds, translates either gene or eide, which Plato uses here interchangeably and which are usually translated by that term, but also by forms or looks. Greatest in the expression the greatest kinds, greatest means the most important ones, because they are the most frequent in the logoi, that is, in the discourses about what is. But before I say more about them, and the community, the koinonia they form, we must first follow the stranger and Theaetetus through various steps to find a fitting way out of the aporia which they just encountered. The stranger begins by asking how it is possible that one and the same thing can be called by several names, more precisely as the example of the human being that he musters for the occasion shows, between the human being himself and all the other things that we say of him, and that we say of him in the same breath that we speak of him himself. The question about the one and the many serves to prepare a new level of reflection, in which the problem of being, as it has been discussed so far, is connected to that of rational speech or logos. Addressing himself to all those who have ever spoken about being, the stranger asks whether being, motion, and rest all partake of one another, or whether there is no combination at all between them, or if some of them, but not others, can form a community. As the concern with speech and speaking about being makes clear, being, motion, and rest are here neither predicates nor names, but, as will become clear soon, already forms of speech, that is, the kinds or looks evoked by the greatest kinds. A lack of community between them would amount to an overthrow of all ontologies and a suppression of logos, of discourse, while total combination would mean the total dissolution of difference. Thus only one alternative is left, namely that some forms mingle and others do not. As already said, being, motion, and rest are already understood here as forms, kinds, or looks, that is, as shapes of visibility in which things present themselves. As such, that is, as forms, some can combine with one another, others cannot, and it is this possibility that allows for logos, or rational speech about what is. What this means is that, according to the stranger, they and their formal combinations are the elementary formal building blocks of speech. Indeed, with the stranger's theory of the greatest kind, Plato sketches out a doctrine of categories avant la lettre. Now, as the expression, the greatest kinds suggests, there are more kinds than the total 5 that the stranger will select for his discussion, and furthermore, that even those that are said to be the greatest, that is, the most frequent ones used in speech, and which therefore enjoy a generality of the highest nature, might also be more numerous. There are definitely more than 5 forms held to be the most important. Their number in the dialogue is determined in view of the goal of the whole examination, namely the demonstration aimed at Parmenides that, in a way, non-being is. But if this list is not complete, it is also because of its principial openness to other categories, if not categories of the other, that the introduction of one kind in particular makes, as might become clear in a moment, inevitable. Now the stranger compares the greatest forms to the letters of the alphabet, that is, the elements of a kind of writing that presupposes a highly powerful process of abstraction. A comparison that has scholars refer to them as the eidetic alphabet or ontological alphabet. The reason for this comparison is to show that some of these forms, the comparison of the letters of the alphabet, that some of these forms combine with one another and others do not. Indeed, some letters of the alphabet do not fit with one another while others do. But the comparison in question serves to make an additional point regarding the kind of community that characterizes the greatest forms. Just as vowels are distinguished from consonants, which, I quote, in passing through them as a sort of bonds, so that without some one of them it's impossible for the others to fit one with another, end quote, so too certain kinds in the eidetic alphabet serve as bonds for the others. Being, for example, is one, but just one such kind that combines with all the others, with motion and rest, for example, even though motion and rest themselves do not conjoin with one another. Now the stranger holds that in the same way as the combination of letters or sounds requires an art to do so, grammar, so too the combination of the intelligible forms requires a knowledge regarding their mixing. Inquiring into an appropriate name for this knowledge the stranger suggests that this knowledge, I quote, which belongs to free man, end quote, is that of the philosopher. However, this knowledge of the philosopher is a post-Parmenidean, if not post-Socratean philosophy, that is, a philosophy in a novel sense. That such is the case will become clear only when the stranger introduces the two other kinds that, in addition to being, motion, and rest, play a crucial role in the community made up by the ultimate constituents of intelligibility. What these forms of intelligibility are at the heart of the ontology developed by the stranger are thus remain to be seen. What they are thus remains to be seen. Before I return to the stranger's discussion of the greatest kinds, let us remind ourselves of his comparison of them to the letters of the alphabet. The letters of the alphabet do not mean anything in themselves, and the analogy of the kinds with letters suggests that the same is true of the eidetic forms. Being undoubtedly is one of these forms, and it follows that it too has no meaning in itself, but only in relation to other forms. With this it appears that the debate with Parmenides, for whom only being is, and non-being cannot be spoken of without contradicting oneself, has been raised to an upper level of reflection. Ultimately, the parricidal point is that without a relation to non-being, being is an empty, meaningless word. So far we have seen that being, motion, and rest are some of the greatest kinds. Being is thus one form among others. However, such co-presence of being with other things, such as motion and rest, deprives being of the exclusive status that it enjoyed in pre-xenological philosophical thought. It is no longer the ultimate instance, and nor are any of the other forms that constitute the greatest kinds. Between them, no hierarchical relation obtains anymore. The stranger's doctrine of the eidetic alphabet presupposes the uncompromised plurality, horizontal equality, and co-originarity of the forms in question. So far, the stranger has referred to being, motion, and rest, to toon, kinesis, and stasis, as three instances of the greatest kind, and established that motion and rest do not mix, while being conjoins with both. Now, of these three, he holds that, I quote, each of them is other than the remaining pair, but itself the same as itself, end quote. The other, or the different, the Greek term is heteron or tateron, and the same, auton, are thus the two additional kinds that raise the number of the greatest kinds to 5. These two forms of intelligibility are introduced as forms that must always necessarily intermix with the 3 other kinds, for otherwise they could not remain distinct kinds. The participation of the kinds of being, motion, and rest in the forms of sameness and otherness makes it possible to speak of each of them as the same as itself and as other than the remaining others. But this is also to say that the additional kinds secure the community between them all, inasmuch as all of them are distinct forms. What the forms of sameness and otherness accomplish with respect to being, motion, and rest is that each one of them is the same that it is insofar as it is different from or other with respect to another form. In other words, the community of the greatest kinds, the koinonia ton genon, is a community that is based on what today we call differentiality. Indeed, in concluding that otherness is a 5th form, the stranger asserts, I quote, that this nature has indeed run through all of the other kinds, for each is other than the others, not because of its own nature, but because it participates in the look of the other, End quote. The form other thus communes with all the other forms. It is this form, and not the internal nature of any of the other four forms, that makes what each one is in particular by way of its difference from the other. What the stranger establishes is that in order to pretend to intelligibility, nothing can be what it is all by itself, that is, on the basis of its own nature, but only insofar as it participates in the form of the different. For the point I want to make, I emphasize that the form of otherness or difference in which all the other kinds participate, and which thus pervades all of them, being included, just as in its own way being pervades all the other forms, is the form that is responsible for the community of which it itself is part. Now let's not lose sight of the fact that this whole discussion of the greatest kind was made necessary in order to find a way out of the impasse between the aporias of being and non-being. It is therefore time to look again at being. The stranger reopens the question by asking, I quote, "Shall we say and contend fearlessly that motion is other than being?" End quote. Indeed, the contention that besides being there is something that is, and that is other than being, is clearly a provocation with respect to Parmenides, because it amounts to affirming clearly that something, in this case, I quote, "motion in its very being is not being, and also being, since it partakes in being," end quote. But this also means, by extension, I quote again, that non-being is, both in the case of motion and with respect to all the kinds. For with respect to all, the nature of the other, by producing each as other than being, makes each not being. So in this sense, we will correctly say that all things are, for the same reasons, non-being, and again, because they partake of being, that they both are and are being, end quote. Let's pause for a moment to gauge the full impact of what is established in these lines, since we are touching here at the core of the stranger's philosophy. What has been demonstrated is that non-being has being. Motion has served as an example for this, but rest the same, and the different could have done the job as well. Even though all these kinds participate in being, but are different from it, they are not the same as it, and are therefore not being. But being itself is therefore also only what it is, to the extent that it is not everything else. In line with the differential logic that constitutes the community between the kinds, the inscription of non-being within being makes being what it is in itself, namely being. For this reason, being stands no longer in a relation of opposition to non-being, but in a relation of difference or otherness. As the stranger remarks, I quote, "Whenever we say non-being, as it seems, we don't say something contrary to being, but only other," end quote. Non-being names every other of being. In the community of the greatest kinds, being then is no longer the contrary, the opposite of non-being, represented by all the other kinds, that because of their participation in the form of being, are merely as others. With the category of the other, the logic of opposition is broken down, and opposition appears only as a relation that is a modification of otherness or difference, as in the opposition between motion and rest. Motion and rest are in opposition. The category or kind of the other not only undermines the oppositional structure of thinking, which in the case of Parmenides culminated in the conclusion that non-being is unutterable, unspeakable, and irrational, it also opens the space of intelligibility to the saying of difference or otherness. By breaking down the opposition of being to non-being, by recasting non-being as what is other than or different from being, it becomes possible to overcome the Parmenidean prohibition and to assert the intelligibility of non-being. It thus becomes possible to speak about non-being without contradicting oneself. This is what the look of otherness or the different accomplishes with respect to non-being, which in the stranger's doctrine no longer refers to what Parmenides called, I quote, things that are not, but to the form of non-being. Yeah. End quote. Before concluding, a further deepening of this category of discursive and ontological intelligibility, the category of otherness, or the other, is thus warranted. After having said that a negative statement does not imply that the negated is the opposite of the subject of negation, but only an other of it, the stranger observes that it seems to him, I quote, that the nature of the other is all chopped up, just like knowledge, end quote. The Greek term for all chopped up, or parceled out, the Greek term for it, kata kakai matistai, comes from the verb kata kermitatsu, a term which contains the word kerma, which means coin or fragment, and which thus means to change into smaller coins. So literally, the word means to make change, namely to go into smaller parts or morsels. This monetary, if not economic, connotation of the verb, which by extension signifies to cut up, to chop up, will prove significant hereafter. That knowledge is all chopped up is easy to understand. Even though knowledge is one, it is parceled out in many arts and forms of knowledge. The comparison undoubtedly is intended for Theaetetus in the dialogue, who as a mathematician finds it still difficult to understand that an elementary form such as otherness could have what the dialogue calls a fragmented, what Stanley Rosen in his commentary calls a fragmented interior, and whose parts therefore are not countable. To the extent that all the greatest kinds stand in a differential relation with one another, they are not what they are in themselves, and hence not treatable as numerical entities. However, if the fragmented interior of otherness causes it to be unlike the other greatest kinds, which exhibit their look within a single thing, is it only, as Stanley Rosen puts it, because, I quote, otherness requires a minimum of two things in order to exhibit its look, end quote. As the additional analogies that the stranger resorts to in order to make his point demonstrate, the comparison serves to argue not only that all parts of otherness have being, but also that, I quote, the opposition between the nature of a part of the other and the nature of being, in that they are set against each other, has beinghood to no less degree, if there is a sanction for saying so, than being itself. For it signifies not the contrary of being, but only this much, its other, end quote. In my interpretation, the stranger here highlights the beinghood of the relation of otherness, which is multiple, if not made up of infinite parts, and that constitutes the form of otherness itself. The kind of the other is made up of an infinite, non-calculable number of relations to otherness, and these relations that have being make up this form as a form with a fragmented interior. The name for the nature of these relations is, as Theaetetus avers, while responding to the stranger's questions of what to call it, clearly, I quote, non-being, the very thing we were seeking because of the sophist, end quote. Non-being is thus, in the stranger's account of the relation to otherness, just as existent, just as real as being itself, and as such, this relation to otherness makes for the possibility of discourse. Having set out to demonstrate against Parmenides that in the same way as being, non-being has also being, the stranger has in fact accomplished more than just refuted the latter's restriction of philosophical thought to the thinking of being. By pressing onward in our inquiry, we have, says the stranger, I quote, disobeyed Parmenides far beyond his prohibition, and have shown him more than he told us not to look into, end quote. As already pointed out, in taking on Father Parmenides, but especially by pressing on in the inquiry of non-being, the stranger has discovered or rediscovered philosophy. What this novel philosophy is transpires in the stranger's following remark. I quote, "We have not only shown that the things that are, we have not only shown that the things that are not are, but we have also declared what the form of non-being happens to be. For we showed that the nature of the other is, and that it's chopped up and distributed through all the things that are in their relation to one another. And we dare to say about each part of this nature in its opposition to being, that this part in its very being, that this part is in its very being non-being," end quote. The philosopher that the stranger introduces is a philosopher of the other, first in an objective sense. By considering non-being, which for Parmenides is absolutely not, as a form, considering it as a form, the form of the other, the nature of non-being changes, not only insofar as it is said to have equal ontological status with being, but also insofar as it is a form that is all chopped up so as to be, I quote, distributed through all things that are in their relation to one another, end quote. When Paul Friedlander speaks of, in his commentary on the Sophist, of the form of non-being as not this being, he means, of course, to highlight the negativity of otherness, which is always a negativity in relation to a determined reality. But by using the formula of not this being to characterize otherness, he touches also, I think, on something essentially new in the stranger's doctrine. Non-being is not only raised to the status of a single form, an eidos among the things that are, but in being all chopped up, this form of intelligibility is broken down like a coin into the smaller units that serve to make single otherness, not this being, but an other being, intelligible and meaningful. The form of otherness or difference is not a form that pervades all things like an abstract generality, but always only in a way that reflects the thing's specific relation to other things. It is always only in relation to another being that a being can be recognized in its single, if not singular, otherness. The form of otherness or difference is other than all the other greatest kinds, in that by nature it is a differential form, as a result of which otherness is each time other. In sum, then, the stranger's philosophy is, in essence, the opening within the logos of thought of an economy of otherness. In any event, the stranger's phenomenological reworking of philosophy has an additional aspect that needs to be brought into relief. Before returning to the question of the nature of the sophist, the stranger sums up what he and Theaetetus have accomplished in the ontological investigation by saying, I quote, let no one tell us that we are declaring non-being to be the contrary of being and then are daring to say that this contrary is. For way back we bade farewell to speaking of some contrary to being, whether it is or is not, whether it is speakable or altogether unspeakable." End quote. I recall that the ontological investigation in the sophist grew out of the encounter of the aphoretic nature of both being and non-being. After the refutation of the Parmenidean notion of non-being, the stranger picks up here the latter's conception of being, arguing that in the process of refuting non-being, he has at the same time also refuted being as Parmenides understood it. Indeed, by stating that being has no contrary, another concept of being, one that knows only otherness and difference, comes into view. But this insight has also implications for the status of opposition within philosophical thought itself. The stranger holds that being and otherness, I quote, intermix with one another, and because being and the other have passed through all and one another, the other, since it has participated in being, is, on account of this participation, yet is not that in which it has participated, but other. And since it is other, it must very clearly be non-being, end quote. However, if being and otherness are coextensive, there is no relation of opposition or contrariness between them, and as a result, opposition is, as I said already before, relegated to a subsidiary role in the community of the greatest kinds, namely to the opposition between motion and rest, which cannot intermix, because if they did, they would revert into their contraries. The philosophy of the stranger is thus a philosophy that by endowing being with otherness takes the oppositional character out of the other in its relation to being, and thus draws it from the start into the community of the kinds. Or rather, it is the form of the other, or the different, that assures the communing of things in the first place. The stranger's new take on philosophy therefore consists in establishing the relation of difference or otherness as the prime relation, and inscribing opposition as a derivative possibility within its web. A moment ago I suggested that the philosophy of the stranger is a philosophy of the other in an objective sense. But this philosophy, as I have emphasized, also originates with him. The stroke of Plato's genius is to have a stranger discover philosophy as a mode of thinking and speaking dominated by the relation to what is different or other. A stranger who, as Theodorus' qualification of him as divine suggests, is also other than the people of the cities in which the philosopher roams. By having a stranger articulate such a new way of philosophizing, Plato not only compels his contemporaries to reconsider what is to be understood as philosophical thought, but also suggests that such thought, as the thought of a stranger or an other, transcends in a fundamental way all native thought, and therefore has, in principle at least, a universal thrust. In offering the leading role in the sophist to a stranger, Plato inscribes into philosophy the place of the foreigner, if not of the other, on the basis of which philosophy can uproot itself from its native thought and thus become able to account for what is other. Put more radically, by inscribing the place of the other into philosophical thought, Plato makes philosophy the logos of the other, of the stranger, the non-native. Philosophy then would belong to the stranger, a stranger who, rather than spinning tales about being that, like those of his Greek predecessors, or, for that matter, of any other civilization, are intelligible only to those that spin them, philosophizes according to the rules of correct speaking about the same and the other. Consequently, in this Greek thing that is philosophy, Greek thought expropriated and expatriated itself. It is not only the opening to the thought of the foreigner, but also the thought of the foreigner within Greek thought. Returning very briefly to my opening, in final conclusion, returning very briefly to my opening remarks regarding the beginnings of Europe, I would like to suggest that besides the notions of rationality, the political, democracy, freedom, and so forth, that Europe has for a long time claimed as its Greek roots, the thought of the stranger, as we have encountered it in the sophist, also has been bequeathed to Europe. Needless to say, however, this heritage, which as we have seen is also that of philosophy understood as the thought of the foreigner, is not just one more legacy among others. It is the legacy that Europe has least assumed or lived up to. Nevertheless, as a significant aspect of the Athenian legacy that has been handed over to Europe and that Europe claims, in addition to the equally important legacy of Jerusalem, as part of its foundation, Europe has a responsibility toward it. However, unlike the question of being, whose forgetting, according to Heidegger, has been instrumental in the formation of Western metaphysical thought, and unlike the forgetting of the political experience of Greece, that, following Arendt, is the core of Western political thought, I do not wish to suggest that the stranger's doctrine has simply been forgotten throughout the West. The category of forgetting or oblivion might not be sufficient to describe the case regarding the thought of the stranger. In it, the figures of the stranger and the foreigner have been topical issues in Europe, at least since the Renaissance, where they did not merely serve, as they do in almost all other cultures, as a foil against which to define oneself and to celebrate one's own humanity, but rather provided a critical perspective onto the West's complacency and cultural arrogance. But the stranger's thought cannot be classified in terms of a handed-down model, that is, a pattern or measure that as an integral part of a patrimony could be forgotten. The philosophy that the stranger teaches presupposes, as we have seen, the parasite of Father Parmenides, of the founding father, hence at least a suspension or epoche of inheritance and the property one owes to ancestors. This philosophy, even though bequeathed to Europe, therefore does not fit the category of the patrimonial. It implies a way of thought that changes the relation to what is handed down. If Europe or the West has not lived up to this thought that requires the radical abandonment and transgression of all autochthony, of all rootedness in oneself, and of all self-identifying retrenchment, it is because, rather than a model, this thought is a formidable injunction and responsibility to disown oneself and to become other than oneself. As responsibility to this injunction, the thought of the stranger is not a model or anything like an ideal to be progressively approximated, which still implies a reservation or withholding, but an unconditional demand at every present moment. It is in itself the realization of the demand in question. Needless to say, such an extreme or hyperbolic exigency is almost impossible to realize. But it is precisely for that reason that it also remains a responsibility and a challenge that has to be met. Before it can make the claim that certain of its origins lie in Greece, Europe has to measure itself up against this legacy of the stranger's logos, and the performance of a disownment that alone generates philosophy, strictly speaking. I think you need the microphone.
Hello, sir. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. My question is, you said opposition is the modification of others. So, can we say that the opposition is a part of the other? Or
Yeah.
it's a different thing?
Right. The discourse of the stranger does not eliminate opposition, right? But relegates it within the doctrine of the greatest kind and the community that they form to a limited role in that case to the relation to between motion and rest. And from the dialogue itself, it is not clear whether there are other kinds or forms of intelligibility that would stand in the relation of opposition. All the others stand in the relation of otherness. And it is in that context that I say that the relation of otherness, is the more general category within which opposition can be carved out. It is a form of relating to contraries, to otherness, but it is not it's not the dominant one, if I may say so. The dominant one is the relation of otherness. Now, it is the question. Your question has, of course, a number of implications. Let me try to, because what is at stake in the sophist is his attempt to establish the community between these forms, these intelligible forms that are called the kinds, or they are forms of intelligibility. So he is trying to establish the community between them. That notion of community is, of course, a logical, an ontological community between intelligible forms. But but parallel to it, one can ask if it has not also implications for social community. And indeed, something like that is at work in the sophist as well. I have not spoken about that. Because, you know, there are five greatest kinds. Even though that the strangers operates with in the discourse, but there are also five protagonists in the Socrates. The Socrates, you know, there's the young Socrates, there's Theaetetus, the stranger, and Theodorus. 5 people, and this is also this discourse is also one of Plato's most pedagogical ones. So it is a dialogue which also creates, implicitly at least, a community between the five protagonists through the stranger. And the question thus, the stranger is the one that brings them together. It is the stranger that it is with respect to the other that he represents, that they are what they are. But the question of opposition that you asked should also have its place there. And one would have to investigate where in that social community of the protagonists of the dialogue, where opposition takes place. Between who? Between who and who? Now, I have no answer to that at this point, but it's something to be kept in mind. Community is based, social community is based on the relation to otherness, primarily. But that does not exclude that that relation can be modified and has modifications and become one of opposition. So the possibility of opposition is inscribed in the relation of opposition, of otherness. Not is a necessary possibility, but how it works as on the social level in the dialogue, that one would have to work out. There was a question. No, you got the answer. Now you should,
So, since I have the mic now,
yeah,
question.
Yeah, please.
Wouldn't it be right in saying that what Protagoreans believe and what Parmenides say, that the idea of permanence, the idea of permanence, or the idea of being, wouldn't it be true in saying, and therefore in believing, that the idea of non-being is not possible? Because, for example, if we imagine a kind of like unicorn, which do not exist, but we take up that something that looks like a horse and has a horn like a rhinoceros. So, but that is also something what we know, and we really cannot think of something that does not exist.
Right.
So, wouldn't it be right in believing this, as what Protagoreans have said?
Yeah. Well, yes. That question, for instance, I have to think a moment how to answer. It would fall within the dialogue. The stranger makes this distinction between those two kinds of making images, and since the faithful copies and distorted copies, icons versus phantasma, and the phantasma are all marked by non-being. So I think the unicorn would fit into that category. But the thrust of his argument is to say that those false images that they have existence, that they are they are not nothing, and but he can make that only, of course, by putting into question, by refuting the Parmenian doctrine that what is not cannot be spoken of, and that one cannot say of it that it has a being of sorts without contradicting oneself. So I think that's the angle that one would have to take on. The doctrine of that, or say, let me say like this: the whole thrust of the stranger's thought is to show that illusion has reality, that it is not nothing. And I would just think that Kant dialectics is an acknowledgement of that, is a continuation of that insight by the stranger. Reason cannot but also go beyond itself. It's natural for reason to speculate about that which it cannot speculate. This is a very difficult. The sophist is considered as the most difficult of Plato, with the Parmenides too. One of the most difficult discourses, not discourses, dialogues. One of the most difficult dialogues, it is also for this a number of very good commentaries, a number of very good books that have been written on it. But I found it very strange that in none of these commentaries, except in none of these commentaries, basically, the stranger's role as a stranger is being recognized, and what that means for Plato's philosophy and for Greek philosophy in general, to be so open to allow a voice that is not native to tell the Greeks what they should think or how they should think. The only one who has seen that is Henri Joly in France, in a small book about the strangers in Greece. So if you read French and you want to follow up on what I presented here, that's the text to look at.
Could you talk a little about where Heidegger takes this discourse of the non-being of being and his notion of motion in terms of becoming and otherness?
Yeah, I'm going to disappoint you because this work on the sophist stems from a seminar that I gave in the spring on the sophist. And I purposely did not include Heidegger in my reading list. When his lectures on the sophist came out in 83, I read them immediately, but I have not gone back through them. So I want to resist a certain Heideggerian reading of it. Do not misunderstand me. It's not because I'm an anti-Heideggerian. Not at all. Not at all. But I want to resist a Heideggerian reading, which I found in a number of the commentaries that I read upon him, especially concerning the interpretation of being as dynamis, as force, as the force to be affected and affect, which is a thesis that the stranger at one time introduces at one moment of his dialogue and his dispute with the other Greek philosophers, but with which he says that he adopts that interpretation for the moment, but he will be ready to drop it later if it should become necessary. and I think he drops it. So and a number of good interpreters of the sophists have followed that line, oblivious to the fact that it is a strategic move of the sophist, of the stranger, to account for what being is. It's not the last word. But Heidegger and some of his followers have not paid attention to that strategic. This is also, when you read this text, one has to be attentive to what, even more so than Stanley, what Stanley Rosen calls the dramatic nature of this dialogue, where you have to look at the characters, where you have to look at the settings, and where you cannot abstract from it. So you cannot approach it, this text, as you could approach an Aristotle, a text by Aristotle, for instance. The argumentation too is not linear. The argumentation is the goal of, one can say so, of the sophist, the dialogue of the sophist, is the stranger's attempt to show Theocritus, the young mathematician, that apart from mathematics, there's philosophy. And he, in order to succeed in doing so, he uses all different kinds of arguments, drops them, uses them up to a point, then drops them, abandons them, and according to what he perceives as necessary to convince the young Theocritus. So you cannot, that's what makes it also so difficult to read this text, because we are trained to read Plato through Aristotelian eyes, and that doesn't work. This is also a literary text, and not, and you have to take all that literariness into account, and that's or what Stanley Rosen calls the dramatic nature of this dialogue, and which is true of all Platonic dialogues.
That dramatic nature gives it a more eclectic feel, like in terms of argumentation. Like,
well, yeah, I do not like the term eclectic, but I know what you mean. Eclectic, I would say it's more strategic than eclectic. The stranger's argumentation, he uses the tools at hand, that he has, the conceptual tools at hand to make his arguments up to a point, and then drops them in order to continue use other sets of conceptual tools. So it's eclectic. In eclectic, there is no end. There's no end to it. But here, the end is to turn Theocritus and the young Socrates, who does not speak, into other philosophers, into new philosophers. That's the aim. Or at least it is one of the aims. Of course, there is also the aim. Another aim is the one which I have tried to expand on today, is the development of a doctrine of otherness, of a conception of intelligibility that is based on the otherness of things, and that is also developed in jumps and leaps, not simply in a straightforward way. It is developed for the young theatres and the other people in the audience, and there's a persuasion, a moment of persuasion and convincing that goes on parallel to it. All right. I think maybe if there are no questions anymore, then
Different from the idea of the plenure in the later 19th century discourse, and or the different from an exile, stranger you are talking about.
One more time, please. Could you reformulate the question?
I just wanted to know whether the stranger you are talking about is similar to, is there any similarity between the idea of a plenure which developed in Walter Benjamin's work in the context of Baudelaire's poetry?
Yeah.
So that plenure and the exile, are they similar, or the a stranger is similar to the plenure and exile, or?
No, it's important.
And how does the community look at the stranger?
Yeah. Yeah. In Benjamin himself, I have not so much found that. There's the problem of exile, of course. But Benjamin is, although I've worked a lot on him, is in this perspective not so much on my mind. But during that time, in Simmel, for instance, Georg Simmel, in the early teens and 20s of the last century, the notion of the stranger is in his book on sociology, for instance, he has a chapter or an appendix devoted to the stranger, which also clearly shows that you cannot think community without addressing that issue. But what I would say in general is that the thrust of the stranger's logos on the stranger, on the other, is still more radical. And what has been elaborated that on the stranger throughout the 19th century and the early 20th does not completely live up to I think it's more now, or in the last several decades, that in philosophical thought, for instance, these questions have become more urgent and more pressing, and that attempts are being made up to think otherness on its own terms, if I may say so.